By the time anyone noticed the pizza burning, one person was dead, another was barely alive, and whoever pulled the trigger had already disappeared. Inside a quiet Farmersville home, broken glass covered the kitchen floor. Chairs had been pushed aside, and a heavy refrigerator appeared to have been moved against the door. 45-year-old Leslie Reeves lay dead in another room. Her date, Chris Smith, had been shot in the head, yet somehow he was still breathing. Investigators found 2 9mm cartridge cases, but no firearm. This was supposed to be Leslie and Chris's first date. Instead, it had become a carefully concealed attack. Who followed Leslie to Farmersville, and how did they know exactly where to find her? By Thanksgiving morning, Nanette Stueber already knew something was wrong. The night before, Leslie Reeves had driven to Farmersville to meet Chris Smith, a man she had connected with online. It was their first date, and Leslie had made sure someone she trusted knew where she was going. Nanette had the location. She knew the plan. At first, there was no reason to believe the evening would become anything more than a simple night out. Then Leslie stopped responding. Nanette called. No answer. She sent messages. Nothing came back. As the hours passed, concern hardened into fear. Leslie was not someone who disappeared without warning, and Nanette could not shake the feeling that the silence meant something had happened. She contacted authorities and requested a welfare check at Chris's home. Then she went there herself. Outside the house, she could only watch. Patrol cars crowded the street. Emergency workers moved quickly in and out of the property, but no one explained what they had found. Nanette saw a man being carried from the house. It was Chris. He was alive, but his condition looked critical. That should have brought some relief. Instead, it created a more terrifying question.
Stay strong, Chris. Clear the area.
Where was Leslie?
I'm right here. We're loading him now.
Nanette searched the faces of the officers. She waited for someone to bring Leslie outside. Minutes dragged on, but Leslie never appeared. The longer the doorway remained empty, the more unbearable the uncertainty became. Eventually, a detective approached her. Leslie had been found inside the home. She had been shot and killed. In a matter of moments, Nanette's fear became certainty. Her friend was gone, Chris was being rushed for emergency treatment, and the only person who might have explained what happened was barely conscious. Investigators were now facing a crime scene with 2 victims, no recovered weapon, and no surviving witness able to speak. But as detectives began asking who might have wanted Leslie dead, the people closest to her were already thinking of the same person. And to Nanette, the answer already felt frighteningly close. Before Leslie Reeves became the name at the center of a murder investigation, she was a mother, an educator, an advocate, and the kind of person who believed strength should be shared. At 45 years old, Leslie had already built a life defined by determination. She held a master's degree in engineering, a demanding achievement that reflected both her intelligence and discipline. But her work was not limited to technical knowledge. Leslie was deeply interested in physical wellness, personal confidence, and helping people feel safer in their own lives. She taught Pilates and encouraged others to become stronger, not only physically, but emotionally. To Leslie, fitness was about far more than appearance. It could restore confidence, create independence, and give someone the courage to reclaim control over their circumstances. That purpose became especially important in her work supporting people affected by domestic abuse. Leslie helped connect those in difficult situations with resources they might desperately need, including counselors, food pantries, and community support organizations. She wanted to create an environment where people could improve their health while also learning how to recognize danger and protect themselves. Fitness, self-defense, and advocacy were all part of the same vision, helping vulnerable people understand that they were not powerless. Friends described Leslie as energetic, compassionate, and intensely committed to the people around her. She was someone who noticed when another person was struggling, someone who did not simply offer sympathy, but tried to find practical help. That is what makes the circumstances surrounding her death especially painful. Leslie spent time encouraging others to leave unsafe situations. She helped people identify unhealthy behavior and understand that fear should never be accepted as a normal part of love. Yet according to those closest to her, Leslie had begun experiencing fear within her own personal life. She was reportedly trying to distance herself from a relationship that had become troubling. Friends believed she wanted to move forward, rebuild her sense of freedom, and begin meeting new people. Her date with Chris Smith may have represented exactly that, not recklessness, but a hopeful step toward a different future. She had shared the location with a trusted friend. She had taken precautions. She had done many of the things people are advised to do when meeting someone new. Yet the danger that followed her that night may not have come from the man she was meeting. It may have come from someone who already knew her. And that left one haunting question at the heart of the investigation. How could a woman so committed to helping others escape danger become the target of the very threat she had warned them about? Chris Smith did not appear to be someone surrounded by danger. At 48, he was a divorced father living a quiet life in Farmersville, a small Illinois community where people knew him for his kindness, his love of music, and the time he spent helping others. He enjoyed gardening and had built a peaceful routine around his home, his family, and his dog, Tiki. Friends described Chris as warm, creative, and community-minded. He played music, worked with his hands, and seemed happiest doing simple things that brought people together. His home was not the kind of place anyone would associate with violence. It was familiar, comfortable, and removed from the chaos that would soon surround it. Leslie had met Chris online. Their conversations had gone well enough for them to arrange a first date on the evening before Thanksgiving. Leslie was reportedly excited about meeting him. After the difficulties she had experienced in her personal life, the date may have felt like a chance to move forward, to spend time with someone new and enjoy an evening without fear or conflict. She also took precautions. Before leaving, Leslie made sure her friend Nanette knew where she was going. She shared the location and stayed in contact during the evening. Nothing in those early moments suggested that the night was becoming dangerous. Leslie and Chris met at a local bar, where the atmosphere appeared relaxed. They talked, shared drinks, and spent time getting to know one another. To anyone watching from across the room, they would have looked like two adults on an ordinary first date, deciding whether their online connection felt the same in person. Eventually, they left the bar and returned to Chris's home. Tiki was there. Music, conversation, and the quiet of the house replaced the noise of the bar. At some point, Leslie and Chris placed a pizza in the oven. It was an everyday decision, the kind made when two people are comfortable enough to let the evening continue. But the pizza would never be eaten. It would remain in the oven until it burned, becoming one of the strangest details investigators found the following morning. Somewhere between the relaxed date and the smell of food beginning to scorch, the atmosphere inside, or just outside, the house changed.
I'm so
Leslie
glad we
and
did
Chris
this.
believed they were alone, beginning a
And
private
now,
evening
pizza
in a
awaits.
quiet town. But evidence
Almost
would
home
later
now.
suggest that someone else was trying to learn where Leslie had gone. Someone who may have watched her leave. Someone who may have followed her route. And while Leslie and Chris settled into the house, that person was apparently getting closer. By the time investigators entered Chris Smith's home, the first date had already become a crime scene. But the room could not tell them everything. Leslie Reeves was found dead from a single gunshot wound to the head. Chris was discovered in the kitchen, gravely wounded by a gunshot to his head but still alive. He could not speak, identify an attacker, or explain how the violence had begun. That left detectives to study what had been disturbed. The glass in a side door was broken. Nearby, the kitchen no longer looked like an ordinary room where two people had been preparing food. The table and chairs had been pushed from their normal positions. Most strikingly, the refrigerator also appeared to have been moved. Investigators began to consider whether those objects had been used to block the entrance. Under the prosecution's later reconstruction, Leslie and Chris may have realized that someone was trying to force their way into the house. In that version of events, they moved furniture toward the side door, attempting to create a barrier between themselves and the person outside. But the barrier did not hold. One 9mm cartridge case was found in the kitchen, close to where Chris lay injured. A second was recovered near Leslie. To prosecutors, the location suggested 2 separate shots fired during the same attack, first at Chris as he tried to help Leslie, and then at Leslie after the intruder had entered farther into the home. There was, however, no surviving eyewitness who could confirm that sequence. Chris had been incapacitated by his injury and would later have no memory of the shooting. Leslie could not describe what she had seen. No camera had recorded the confrontation. Every movement had to be inferred from the physical evidence left behind. And not every detail was undisputed. The defense later challenged the claim that Leslie and Chris had moved the refrigerator to block the door. Attorneys pointed to the absence of fingerprints, blood, or other physical evidence proving that Leslie had touched or pushed it. They argued that the room's condition did not establish exactly who had moved the furniture, or when. That distinction mattered. Broken glass could suggest forced entry, but it could not identify the person who broke it. Displaced furniture could indicate a desperate struggle, but it could not reveal every action that occurred. The 2 cartridge cases proved that shots had been fired, yet the firearm itself was missing. Someone had apparently left the house with it. Investigators could see the aftermath: a burned pizza, shattered glass, one person dead and another clinging to life. What they could not yet see was the path the attacker had taken to reach that particular address. Chris lived in a small village nearly an hour from Leslie's home. The location was not somewhere a stranger would simply stumble upon in the middle of the night. So if the gunman had not been invited inside, why had he traveled to this specific house? And more importantly, who had told him Leslie was there? For nearly 12 hours, Chris Smith lay wounded on the kitchen floor with no one knowing he was still alive. The attack was believed to have happened during the early hours of Thanksgiving morning. Outside, Farmersville remained quiet. Families were sleeping or preparing to begin the holiday. Inside Chris's home, the pizza continued burning in the oven. Leslie lay motionless in another room, and Chris was unable to call for help. A gunshot had caused catastrophic damage to his head. He could not stand, reach a telephone, or alert anyone passing outside. As the hours went by, the temperature inside the house dropped, and every minute reduced his chances of survival. But Chris was not completely alone. His dog, Tiki, stayed close beside him. Investigators and those close to Chris later believed that Tiki's body warmth may have helped protect him from the cold while he remained on the floor. The dog could not summon help or explain what had happened, but she refused to leave him. In a house marked by violence and silence, Tiki remained beside her owner until emergency responders finally arrived. When officers entered the property following Nanette Stueber's welfare check request, Chris was barely conscious. His breathing was faint, but he was alive. Paramedics rushed him from the home, and doctors immediately confronted the extent of his injuries. The bullet had entered his head and caused severe trauma to his brain. To reduce the dangerous swelling, surgeons removed part of his skull. They also removed some bullet fragments, although not all of them could safely be taken out. Chris was then placed in a medically induced coma. At that moment, no one could say whether he would survive the night. His family faced the possibility that the quiet, community-minded father they knew might never awaken. Even if he did regain consciousness, doctors could not predict how much damage the bullet had caused, or what kind of life would remain possible for him. Investigators were waiting for answers too. Chris was the only person found alive inside the house. If he had seen the attacker enter, heard a voice, recognized a face, or witnessed Leslie's final moments, his memory could have transformed the investigation. One clear description might have identified the gunman. One remembered detail might have explained why someone had traveled to his home. But detectives could not interview a man fighting for his life. As Chris remained unconscious, Investigators had to work without the one witness who might have seen everything. They turned instead to the evidence inside the house, the movements of Leslie's vehicle, and the final calls and messages she had exchanged before the shooting. Those conversations revealed that the night may not have begun with a stranger watching from the darkness. According to Leslie's friends, she had already been afraid of someone from her past. And when detectives asked who might have followed her to Farmersville, one name began appearing again and again. When Robert "Bobby" Tarr sat down with detectives, he had not yet been charged with anything. Investigators were still trying to understand Leslie's final hours, and Tarr had an opportunity to explain where he had been when the shooting occurred. His first answer appeared simple. Tarr told detectives that he did not know Farmersville. He described making only a brief trip that night to collect money from a friend before returning home. After that, he claimed, he had stayed there. On its own, the account did not prove or disprove anything. People forget exact times. Journeys can be described poorly. A nervous interview can make an innocent person appear uncertain. But detectives did not rely solely on Tarr's memory. They interviewed his teenage daughter separately. Her description of the night did not match his. According to her account, Tarr had left the house more than once. She recalled him returning emotionally upset, appearing agitated in a way that stood out to her. Later, during the early morning hours, she woke again and heard him moving around the home. He was pacing. Then he started doing laundry. Could there have been an ordinary explanation? Perhaps Tarr could not sleep. Perhaps he was upset for reasons unrelated to Leslie. Washing clothes in the early morning was unusual, but unusual behavior was not evidence of murder. Still, every new detail created another question. Why had Tarr said he remained home if his daughter remembered him leaving again? Why had he described such a limited journey when someone inside his own house recalled more movement? And why did his behavior appear so unsettled during the same hours Leslie and Chris were attacked? Then investigators asked about a firearm. Tarr's daughter described a small handgun she had previously seen inside his room. It was the kind of detail detectives could not ignore because two 9mm cartridge cases had been recovered from Chris Smith's home, while the weapon used in the shooting had disappeared. When police looked for the firearm his daughter described, it was no longer where she remembered seeing it. That did not automatically make it the murder weapon. A gun can be moved, sold, stored elsewhere, or remembered incorrectly. But when detectives combined the missing firearm with Tarr's changing timeline, the interview began to take on a different meaning. They returned to his account. Had he really stayed home? Had he traveled farther than he initially admitted? Did he know more about Farmersville than he had told them? As detectives confronted Tarr with the inconsistencies, parts of his story began to change. Details that had first sounded definite became less certain. His movements expanded beyond the brief trip he had initially described. Each modification could be explained as a corrected memory. But taken together, the changes raised a larger concern. Was Tarr gradually remembering the truth, or adjusting his account as investigators revealed what they already knew? Detectives now had several troubling elements. A former partner Leslie was reportedly afraid of, an alibi contradicted by someone inside his home, unusual behavior during the early morning, and a firearm that could no longer be located. But contradictions were not enough to prove that Tarr had entered Chris Smith's house. A person could lie out of panic. A daughter could misremember the timing. A missing firearm could be unrelated. Even a deeply suspicious story was still only a story. Investigators needed independent evidence, something that could not change during another interview. They needed to determine where Tarr's vehicle had traveled, where his phone had connected, and what he had searched for before Leslie was killed. Because a changing account could create suspicion. But the digital trail could reveal where he had actually gone after midnight. Tarr's account could change. The data recorded by his vehicle, telephone, and financial transactions could not. Investigators began by examining his movements after midnight. A license plate reader had captured Tarr's vehicle away from his home during the hours surrounding the attack. The recorded journey immediately challenged his original claim that he had returned from a short errand and remained home for the rest of the night. Then detectives found a gas station transaction. The purchase provided another fixed point in the timeline, one connected to a specific location and time. Tarr had been traveling when he initially claimed he was at home. But a vehicle could be driven for many innocent reasons. A fuel receipt could prove that Tarr had gone somewhere without proving that he had traveled to Chris Smith's house. Investigators needed evidence that brought him closer to Farmersville. His cell phone records did exactly that. Cell tower data showed Tarr's phone connecting in the Farmersville area during the period investigators believed Leslie and Chris were attacked. It did not place the device inside one particular room, and it could not show who was holding it. But it contradicted the idea that Tarr had spent the night at home, far away from the crime scene. The question was no longer whether he had traveled. It was why he had traveled there. Detectives next examined what had been happening on Tarr's phone before the shooting. Investigators recovered deleted internet searches connected to Chris Smith, including searches for Chris himself and his home address. That discovery was difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Tarr had told detectives that he did not know Farmersville. Yet his search history suggested that someone using his phone had been trying to identify the man Leslie was meeting and determine where that man lived. Prosecutors also said Tarr researched whether using a virtual private network, a VPN, could stop law enforcement from tracking a cell phone. A VPN can disguise certain internet activity, but it does not necessarily prevent a phone from connecting to nearby cellular towers. To prosecutors, the search suggested that Tarr was already thinking about whether his movements or online activity could later be discovered. The digital evidence also revealed his state of mind before the attack. Tarr had communicated with a friend about his suspicion that Leslie was traveling to see another man. Prosecutors argued that jealousy and the fear of losing control drove him to monitor her movements. Their theory was that Tarr first followed Leslie as she traveled toward Farmersville, learned where she had gone, and then returned later after she and Chris had settled inside the house. The data appeared to create a journey in stages. First, Tarr became suspicious of Leslie's plans. Then searchers connected him to Chris Smith and Chris's address. A license plate reader and gas purchase recorded Tarr traveling after midnight. Finally, cell phone evidence placed his device near Farmersville during the critical hours. Any one of those details might have had an innocent explanation. A person might search for a stranger out of curiosity. A driver might purchase fuel late at night. Cell tower evidence can cover a broad area rather than one exact address. But when investigators arranged the evidence chronologically, each piece appeared to reinforce the next. Tarr had denied knowing the town. His phone suggested otherwise. He claimed he remained home. His vehicle, transaction records, and cell phone movements contradicted him. And someone had apparently searched for the precise address where Leslie would later be found dead. The digital trail could place Tarr near Farmersville and challenge nearly every part of his original account, but it still could not show him firing a weapon. To complete their case, investigators needed something physical, something connected not only to Tarr, but to the 2 cartridge cases recovered from Chris Smith's home. Could they find the missing gun before it disappeared forever? The digital evidence had brought investigators close to Tarr, but the most important piece of physical evidence was still missing. 2 9mm cartridge cases had been recovered from Chris Smith's home. The firearm that discharged them was nowhere at the scene. Whoever left the house appeared to have taken the weapon with them. Investigators searched for it, but initially found nothing. Then a recorded jail call raised a new concern. During the conversation, Tarr reportedly asked a friend to retrieve and dispose of items he referred to as brackets. To investigators, the vague wording sounded suspicious. Was brackets an innocent reference to building materials, or was Tarr using coded language for something he did not want authorities to find? Police searched Tarr's property. What they initially recovered were exactly what the word suggested: actual brackets and construction materials. There was still no firearm. For the defense, this mattered. Officers had already examined the property without discovering a gun. If a weapon appeared later in an area they had searched, questions would inevitably arise about when it arrived, who placed it there, and whether the discovery could be trusted. Days later, members of Tarr's family contacted authorities. They reported that a handgun and ammunition had been found outside on the property. The weapon was handed over in a plastic bag. It was a Springfield Hellcat 9mm pistol. Investigators sent it for forensic testing. The result transformed the case. Ballistics examiners concluded that the cartridge cases recovered from Chris Smith's home had been fired from that weapon. The missing gun from the crime scene had apparently been found in Tarr's yard. There were additional connections. Tarr's fingerprint was reportedly discovered on the plastic bag containing the firearm. Leslie Reeves's DNA was found on part of the gun itself. To prosecutors, the evidence completed the chain. Tarr's phone had placed him near Farmersville. His searches connected him to Chris and the address. His statements about his movements had changed. Now, a firearm linked to the shooting had been recovered from his property. But the defense offered a sharply different interpretation. Tarr claimed that the gun belonged to Leslie. He suggested that someone had planted it on his property to frame him. His attorneys emphasized that no fingerprints or DNA belonging to Tarr were reportedly recovered directly from the firearm itself. The location of the discovery also remained controversial. Police had already searched the yard. How had they failed to find the gun the first time? Had it been concealed so well that officers overlooked it? Or had it appeared there only after their search? Those questions gave the defense something to challenge. Yet the ballistic evidence itself was powerful. The pistol recovered from Tarr's property was not simply the same model or caliber as the suspected weapon. Examiners linked it to the cartridge cases left inside Chris Smith's home. Investigators now had a firearm connected to the shooting, a digital trail leading toward Farmersville, and statements that repeatedly conflicted with recorded evidence. But one uncertainty remained. The only person who had survived inside the house was still struggling to recover, and investigators did not know whether Chris Smith would ever remember the face of the person who shot him. When Chris Smith finally opened his eyes, nearly 2 months had passed. He woke in January 2022, surrounded by hospital equipment, family members, and questions he could not answer. He did not know why he was there. He did not remember the gunshot, the long hours on the kitchen floor, or the woman investigators said had been with him that night. When someone mentioned Leslie Reeves, Chris did not recognize her name. The two had spoken and exchanged messages before their date. They had spent the evening together. Yet the injury had erased all of it. To Chris, the date, the attack, and Leslie herself were missing pieces in a night he could no longer access. His survival had come at an enormous cost. The bullet had caused severe damage to his brain. During treatment, Chris suffered 2 strokes and underwent 6 brain surgeries. Part of the bullet remained lodged inside his head because doctors believed removing it could cause even greater harm. The physical effects changed almost every part of his life. The left side of his body was partially paralyzed. His leg had limited movement above the knee and no movement below it. His arm no longer worked as it once had. Tasks that had required no thought, standing, walking, driving, or moving through his home, now demanded assistance, therapy, and exhausting concentration. After leaving the hospital, Chris could not return to the life he had known. He moved back in with his mother. He could no longer live independently, see his daughter as often as before, or care for Tiki in the same way. The home where the attack occurred was eventually lost. Rehabilitation became his new routine. Day after day, Chris worked to strengthen his body and recover whatever independence might still be possible. Progress was slow. Some abilities returned only in small degrees. Others did not return at all. Yet he continued therapy and worked toward the possibility of walking with less assistance. But the one recovery investigators needed most never came. Chris could not remember the face of the attacker. He could not describe a voice, a struggle, or the moment someone entered the house. He could not tell detectives whether the gunman had been invited inside or forced through the side door. He could not identify who shot Leslie. His survival showed the devastating consequences of the attack, but it did not directly identify the person responsible. And still, Chris refused to let the shooting take everything from him. Music had been important to him before the attack. Eventually, he returned to the stage as the lead singer of his rock band. Singing did not restore what he had lost, but it gave him a place where he could feel like himself again. He also began sharing his recovery story, hoping his experience might encourage others not to give up. Chris had survived an injury doctors feared would leave him with almost no meaningful recovery. But survival was not the same as returning to normal. A fragment of the bullet remained in his brain, his memory of that night remained blank, and every day carried reminders of the life taken from him. When the case reached court, there would be no eyewitness pointing across the room. The verdict would depend on whether the phone records, vehicle movements, changing statements, recovered firearm, and forensic evidence formed one convincing picture. Chris had survived what should have killed him. Now the jury would have to decide who had tried. By the time Robert "Bobby" Tarr went on trial, the case had become a battle between two very different interpretations of the same evidence. Prosecutors told the jury that Tarr could not accept Leslie Reeves moving on without him. They argued that jealousy drove him to discover who she was meeting, search for Chris Smith and his address, and follow her journey to Farmersville. They pointed to the digital trail, Tarr's phone near the area, his vehicle traveling after midnight, the gas station transaction, and deleted searches connected to Chris. They also emphasized the changes in his story. Tarr had first denied knowing Farmersville and claimed he had remained home, but investigators later uncovered evidence suggesting otherwise. Then there was the firearm. A Springfield Hellcat 9mm pistol recovered from Tarr's property was matched to the cartridge cases inside Chris's home. Tarr's fingerprint was found on the plastic bag containing it. Prosecutors argued that the evidence showed Tarr forced his way through the side door, shot Chris in the kitchen, and then killed Leslie before leaving with a gun. The defense asked the jury to focus on what investigators had not found. There were no fingerprints or DNA belonging to Tarr inside Chris's house. No blood, broken glass, or other physical material from the scene was reportedly recovered from Tarr's vehicle. Chris had no memory of the attack and could not identify the person who shot him. The defense also challenged the discovery of the firearm. Police had already searched Tarr's property before the gun was reportedly found in the yard and handed over by family members. Tarr claimed the weapon belonged to Leslie and argued that someone had placed it there to frame him. His attorney said the prosecution had built a suspicious story, but not one that eliminated reasonable doubt. For 1 week, jurors heard testimony, examined timelines, and considered whether each clue could have an innocent explanation. Then they began deliberating. Less than 3 hours later, they returned to the courtroom. The jury found Tarr guilty of first-degree murder for Leslie's death and attempted first-degree murder for the shooting of Chris Smith. There had been no eyewitness identification and no confession. The verdict rested on the conclusion that the phone records, changing statements, vehicle movements, and recovered firearm were not isolated coincidences. Together, the jury believed they told one story. Robert "Bobby" Tarr continued to deny responsibility, even after the jury found him guilty. In July 2024, the court imposed consecutive prison terms for Leslie Reeves's murder and the attempted murder of Chris Smith, including firearm enhancements. Together, the sentences amounted to 85 years. Tarr appealed, arguing that the punishment was excessive and had not been properly imposed. But in April 2026, the Illinois Appellate Court rejected those claims and affirmed the sentence. For Leslie's loved ones, however, the legal outcome could never restore what had been taken. Her friends continued honoring the work she had devoted her life to: fitness, personal safety, domestic abuse awareness, and helping vulnerable people find support. Leslie deserved to be remembered not only for how she died, but for how fiercely she tried to protect others. Chris continued rebuilding a life permanently altered by the shooting. The date did not become deadly because Leslie trusted the wrong new person. According to the case proven in court, the danger came from someone who could not accept that she was choosing a future without him. Which piece of evidence convinced you most? Tarr's changing alibi, the deleted searches for Chris Smith, or the gun recovered from his property? Share the clue that broke the case for you in the comments. For more carefully researched true crime documentaries that remember the people behind the headlines, subscribe and join us here next time.